Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Eduyot. We are up to Perek Zayin Mishnah Bet. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilu Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Ranbayev Eliyahu ben Burchai Israelov Chana bat Miriam Sason ben Ryan Yoshua ben Shifra Menuchatam began Eden Amen Elabdir ben Chaim lechaim v'derefua shelemav Daniel Shalom ben Rosa betor shar cholei Yisrael and achlama merav Binyamin Od Zion Chai ben Dvorah. Edible grasshoppers would be pickled in salt in order to preserve them. When this is done, the salt draws out the natural fluid that is in the grasshopper. The Mishnah, which also appears in Terumot chapter 10, Mishnah 9, discusses whether the fluid of non-kosher grasshoppers may be eaten. Some grasshoppers are forbidden to be eaten and some are permitted. The Mishnah refers to the forbidden ones. He'id Rabbi Tzadok al tzira chagavim tmeim shu taor. Rabbi Tzadok testified that the fluid of non-kosher grasshoppers is kosher. It is permitted to be eaten because the fluid of the grasshopper is not considered part of the grasshopper but a separate entity. This fluid is not classified as regular blood. Therefore, unlike blood, which is considered part of the body, the fluid of a grasshopper is a distinct item. The fluid of a non-kosher grasshopper may therefore be eaten. This testimony was needed to refute an earlier Tanaic teaching. Shemishna Rishonah, for an earlier Mishnah, had stated that this was from an old version of the Mishnah that existed before the Mishnayot were arranged by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi. Chagavim tmeim shenichbeshu im chagavim teorim lo faslu tziran. If non-kosher grasshoppers were pickled together with kosher grasshoppers, the fluid of the non-kosher grasshoppers does not make the fluid of the kosher grasshoppers forbidden. Rather, the mixture of the fluids is permitted for consumption. This earlier Mishnah permits only the mixture of the fluids, which implies that if the fluid of the non-kosher grasshoppers would be on its own, it would be forbidden. Rabbi Tzadok testified that this is not correct. Rather, the fluid of the non-kosher grasshoppers is permitted even on its own. Since the fluid of a grasshopper is not defined as blood, biblical law permits the fluid of non-kosher grasshoppers. According to the earlier Mishnah, however, the sages decreed that the fluid of a non-kosher species is forbidden. They allowed it to be consumed only when it is mixed with the fluid of kosher grasshoppers. Rabbi Tzadok testified that in fact the fluid of non-kosher grasshoppers is permitted in all circumstances, even when it is by itself. And that is then of Mishnah Bet. Now, two types of water are used for purification purposes: rainwater and water from a spring. In most cases, a person or utensil can be purified through immersion in rainwater. However, there are situations that require spring water, such as the immersion of a zav. In addition to the immersion of a zav, spring water is also needed to prepare the mechatat and to sprinkle on a mitzvah to purify him. In each of these cases, the Torah requires ma'im chaim, living water, which refers to spring water. Rainwater cannot be used for any of these purposes. Another halachic difference between spring water and rainwater is that spring water can purify even when it is flowing, while rainwater must be collected in a pool and a mikveh in order to be effective. A third difference is that any amount of spring water is enough for purification as long as the item being purified is completely immersed, whereas a mikveh of rainwater cannot purify unless it has a volume of at least 40 se'ah. Mishnah Gimel, which also appears in Mikvaot, chapter 5, Mishnah 5, cites a testimony about spring water that was mixed with rainwater. He'id Rabbi Tzadok al Zochalin sherabu al notfim. Rabbi Tzadok testified about a mixture of both types of water in which the flowing water, spring water, is more than the trickling water, the rainwater. In Mikvaot, chapter 5, Mishnah 5, the Mishnah begins by saying flowing water is like spring water, meaning the water in a stream or river that flows from a spring is the same as the water in the spring itself. It then states, and trickling water is like a mikveh of rainwater, which teaches that even after rainwater reaches the ground and trickles downward, it still has the status of rainwater. That Mishnah then continues with a testimony that is also cited here, Shem Ksherim, that the mixture is fit to be used wherever spring water is required. Since most of the water in the mixture is spring water, the mixture is treated as though all of it is spring water. This follows the general rule of bitul berov, nullification and a majority. The Mishnah tells of an incident in which this ruling was applied in practice. Maaseh haya bebirat Pilya. There was an incident in Birat Pilya where a larger amount of flowing spring water and a smaller amount of trickling rainwater became mixed together. And the matter was brought before the sages, and they deemed the mixture fit for use as spring water. And that is the Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.